Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who is tired of voting for the lesser of two evils, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more than two choices on the ballot, we believe two choices are too few and talk about the problems the duopoly causes and the reforms that can fix it. Now, many of Trump's critics have asked if he's qualified for the job of president, and after watching the first few weeks of his second term play out, a better question is, does Trump know what the job is at all? Whether it's offering an unauthorized buyout deal for federal employees or letting Elon Musk take over the Treasury with a gang of interns too young to rent a car, Trump's critics argue his actions are overstepping the constitutional bounds of his office. But is Trump really stepping outside the constitutionally granted authority of the office of president? And if so, is he all that different from his predecessors? We're going to discuss how the founders envisioned the role of president, how that's changed over time, and how his predecessors may have paved the way for what now appears to be an imperial presidency. But first, Shawn, it is week 3 of 208 of Trump's second term. And this week, he floated a proposal to take over Gaza. So, I mean, I thought Greenland was a dumb idea, but there we go.
It's wow. It's a very combustible idea because it adds a complex variable to an already complex and volatile situation in the Middle East. In October of 2023, we have the terrorist attack on Hamas in Israel, which led to the war between the Israeli government and Hamas, which displaced millions of Palestinians, killed tens of thousands of Palestinians, left Gaza in ruins. And then right before Biden leaves, there's a ceasefire agreement to return the hostages over a course of a series of phases. So we've just passed one phase of this agreement, and we're in the middle of the next phase. And this announcement comes in the middle of what is already a very contentious situation, a very volatile situation between Hamas and the Israeli government that could fall through.
Yeah. If they want to scare Hamas into negotiating, they should show them what Trump did to Atlantic City, because I think that would bring them right to the table. That out of the way. You can either laugh or cry, my man. So let's get into the main story here, because I think that fits into a larger pattern that we've seen with Trump, which is his disregard for the limits of executive authority. And in his short time in office so far, he's issued a number of controversial decrees. He's encouraged members of the CIA to resign en masse. He's dissolved U.S. aid, frozen government funding. And first off, I'm going to let the listener off the hook with the question, is he stepping outside of his constitutionally granted authority? He totally is. He totally is. There's like not even a question. But the follow-up, and what you and I are going to explore here, Shawn, is how does this fit into the larger history of presidential overreach? And we're going to dive into that. But I think first, I think it makes sense for us to talk about how the presidency was originally designed, because I think that'll help frame things well. What do you think, Shawn?
I think that's a good idea.
All right, so let's start off. So the first thing we ought to do, we got to go all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And we should note that in the beginning of this republic, the founders feared a strong executive. They feared instituting another monarch. And interestingly enough, the first government, the Articles of Confederation, didn't have a president at all. It had a really weak Congress that couldn't really do much of anything. And so eventually there was civil unrest, and some people started asking for a new monarch. The military actually approached George Washington to try to instill him as some sort of military dictator / monarch. And so with that came the Constitutional Convention and the debate over whether we should have a strong executive or not. And some actually argued, such as Alexander Hamilton, that the president ought to be an elected monarch, somebody who sits for life. But ultimately, they settled on the presidency we have today. And so what we ended up with was someone who had the power to enforce the laws and someone who had the power to prevent Congress from passing laws, but they couldn't actually enact any policy themselves. And so that kind of kept them in a little box. And the first two presidents were actually really good at resisting the urge to go outside the scope of their office. So George Washington was very, very careful about seeking congressional approval when warranted. John Adams, also same thing. Every other president threw it out the window completely, and since then has tried to get away with anything that Congress will allow them to do. So now after Adams, there are constant instances of presidents pushing the envelope over time. Some which have been justified by history, some which have not. Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus was obviously a big one, very controversial at the time. My favorite, actually, from the 1800s is Thomas Jefferson. The Louisiana Purchase, I didn't know this until I started prepping for this episode. Louisiana Purchase was actually done without congressional authority. Mm-hmm. Did you know this?
I did know this, yeah.
I had no idea. I had no idea. So if you're listening and you didn't know this, you're going to love this. So he went around Congress and incorporated the Louisiana Purchase as part of a treaty, which the president has the power to do. Mm-hmm. So he doubled the size of America, doubled the size of the country, no congressional authority at all.
It's interesting because much of the U.S.'s expansion has come without congressional approval.
I absolutely found that hysterical, because how are you going to reverse it? Like, what are you going to do? And so this is kind of how it goes in the 1800s. The big change, I think, in executive overreach happens in the Great Depression. And so FDR signs somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 executive orders to grow the federal government during the New Deal. And his argument is that the Great Depression is a national emergency, and he needs to be able to establish these different programs to keep people employed and ensure stability. And that move, I think I would, in some circles today, is still controversial. Some people ask the question whether he unduly expanded the size and power of the federal government, and whether that actually had the intended benefit of getting the U.S. out of the Great Depression. This is a debate that's still going on today. And to be frank, in some conservative circles, there's the argument that the federal government never should have gotten to this size. And I think if you were to go back in time to 1800 and you were to tell people that the federal government was that big, they'd throw up. I mean, that was their biggest fear. I think what a lot of people don't understand, and this is kind of a non sequitur, is that the revolution was not one country fighting for its independence. It was 13 colonies fighting a common enemy for their independence. So this country is designed to be fractious. So after that, what we start to see presidents do is we start to see them take actions or do end runs around Congress for issues of national security. So you've got, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, you've got Iran-Contra, you've got the Kosovo War in the 90s. And I really kind of view that as its own discrete era, because it's unlike, I think, the type of executive overreach we're going to see once we cross the year 2000, but it does in some ways set a precedent.
Yeah. So for much of U.S. history, we do see that the most egregious overreaches by the presidency have to do with military action, war powers, things of that nature, what you discussed. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because the number of military conflicts the U.S. has actually been involved in dwarfs the number of wars that have been approved by Congress, the number of official wars that have been declared by Congress. And I think it's important to note to the listener that executive orders on their own aren't necessarily a bad thing. I know when I hung out in conservative circles back in college, the idea of an executive order made them cringe because there was this skepticism over how much power the president can have. But executive orders can serve an important function, and that is to instruct the administration, certain agencies and departments on how to enforce existing law passed by Congress, right? How that administration wants to see those laws enforced by particular departments and agencies and his administration. So in that way, the executive order does serve a function, but it has been used in this overreach as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I know we've kind of asked the listener to absorb a lot of history in a very short period of time. But, to your point, we have very sparse use of executive orders until the Great Depression. And then after that, it's primarily used for national security. But then some things start to happen once we cross into the year 2000. Now, there's still this kind of defense, national security focus. So, for example, the authorization for the use of military force in 2001, that effectively gave the president near unlimited military power. And that really led to the kind of the forever wars that we were stuck in up until recently. There was the NSA surveillance program, again, unchecked executive expansion into domestic spying. And if we go a little further into the Obama years, look, Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize and then killed how many people via drone strikes?
Yeah.
I mean, give him another medal before he kills again. So there's there's a thread there, but then there's also this other thing that starts happening, which is they start using executive orders to get around Congress for policy. And I don't know if this starts it, but the earliest I can see where this happens is TARP. Where we have the global financial crisis, Congress rejects the bailout, and Bush finds a way to use Treasury funds to make that happen. And I think that's the first instance where we see a non-national security related use of an executive order, and an instance where the president is truly going over Congress's head.
And we really see it start where Congress gets to this point where neither party wants to work together. So we see the beginning of perpetual gridlock, because in the 90s, as we discussed in last week's episode, you had instances where Bill Clinton could work with Republicans in Congress to pass a budget, right? And before that, George H.W. Bush could work with Congress to get things done, right? And there was some overlap between Republicans and Democrats working together to get things done. But starting in the 2000s is when you really start to see that gridlock, that divide between the parties widen so much that there is no more overlap. There is no more working together. And so the president started to use the executive order, the executive authority, as a way of trying to circumvent Congress altogether, even though, in a lot of instances, the president didn't really have the authority to do it.
You're spot on there. I'll expand on the idea a little bit and give the listener a little more detail, because there's a site called VoteView that has some great visualizations of political polarization in Congress. Mm-hmm. And one of the charts it looks at is how often are members of Congress crossing the aisle to vote for legislation sponsored by the other party, and starts at the Civil War, ends sometime recently, right? But what happens is, obviously during the Civil War, there's no overlap. Polarization is as high as it's ever going to be. And that continues until probably about the 1900s. And then it starts to tick up, and it reaches its peak probably around the 60s or 70s. Now in the 80s, it falls off a cliff. And you see levels now similar to what they were during the Civil War. But to get back to your point, we see the two parties diverge to such a point where Congress can't really agree on anything. Mm-hmm. So, the president needs to use executive orders just to get anything done. The idea of a Republican president passing a measure past a Democratic Congress is as unlikely as a Democratic president passing a measure with the help of a Republican Congress.
And I think what we see with Trump is part of the reason why we've seen such an uptick in this happening, whether it was with Obama or whether it was with Trump in his first term or Biden during his presidency. And that is, these candidates made promises on the campaign trail to their voters, right? They have a legacy that they have to look after. And you can't get anything done when Congress can't work together. And so the only way that they could even hope to make their campaign promises a reality is through the executive order, which is exactly what the type of stuff we've heard from Trump, right? His narrative right now is, I've done more than any other president in my first 3 weeks. because he signed all these executive orders. And so he's doing this to keep his campaign promises, even if it isn't legal.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
And now, first off, I'll just throw this out there to Trump. Nobody cares if you don't follow through on your promises.
Right.
I'm amazed that the one thing he chooses to hold himself accountable for is implementing a bunch of ridiculous promises that most of his voters were hoping he wouldn't follow through on.
Yeah.
Right? Because I talked to a lot of people who were pro-Trump, voting for Trump, and I say, well, what do you think about this policy or that policy or whatever? And they say, oh, he's not going to do that. He's the first figure in American politics where his supporters are saying he's not going to do what he says he's going to do when he's in office. And then he does it.
Yeah.
And if we want to zoom out a little bit and we really want to take a look at Biden and Trump together, what we see in their executive orders are moves focused entirely on their base. So we almost have a situation where the president is serving their partisan base over the majority of voters.
Mm-hmm.
And arguably, I'll give Biden credit. Biden did manage to pass bills. He did have a majority in both chambers of Congress, so there's that. But, to your point, the student loan forgiveness program, I mean, again, not legal. And so I think what we're seeing is gridlock and polarization have made Congress an ineffective body for a number of reasons. I mean, we talked about this in the last episode with the budget, and presidents are increasingly using executive orders to get policy done, but really focusing that policy on their base.
And it's really creating a concerning situation for a lot of Americans because you have a Congress that's paralyzed by polarized gridlock. You have a president that is overstepping his authority. And the only institution that we can rely on is the judicial system. Right now, we have to rely on the courts in order to be that kind of check that Congress isn't going to be on the president in order to stop these. And we've seen we saw the courts intervene during Trump's first administration with the Muslim ban. We saw the courts intervene with the student loan forgiveness program that Biden tried to institute. So far, this institution is holding up, but the concern is for how long?
Yeah, and I think in some respects, with everything Trump's doing, he's effectively saying, try me.
Yeah, Trump is relying on the fact that he appointed, 6 of these justices as, that they're going to be loyal to him when it comes time. But it's worth noting that Trump failed more before the Supreme Court in his first term than any other president in modern U.S. history as a result of many of these executive orders he signed, which I don't know if you know this, but he signed in his first term 220 executive orders.
Yeah.
And I think he's going for the record this term.
Right.
So yeah.
100%. I just looked it up now. So in his first term, here's something interesting for you. So George W. Bush, in his 2 terms, 291 executive orders.
Mm-hmm.
Barack Obama, 2 terms, 276. Donald Trump, 1 term, 220.
Yeah.
Okay. Then Joe Biden, 162. So he actually beat, and to be fair, he beat Obama and Bush in all but 1 term. So he's on a bit of a tear. Donald Trump so far, 54. He is 3 weeks in office.
And to be fair, he's not the only president to go crazy on the executive orders. Like we talked about, FDR had signed 3,000 executive orders during his time. John F. Kennedy, from 1961 to his death in 1963, had signed 214. So he almost signed as many executive orders in just 2 years that Trump did in his first term. So this isn't new, but it is mostly unprecedented, especially in the modern era for presidents to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, people are asking where are the Democrats? I honestly think they're afraid that if they push too far, and this goes to the Supreme Court, they could find that Trump is given the authority to do all these things. And at least there's some vagueness about it. Mm-hmm. And I think the interesting thing, and I've thought this for a while, is, Trump's kind of a stress test on the system. He's acting exactly as the founders feared a strong executive might act.
Mm.
And we're starting to see flaws in the system. And I would argue, you go all the way back to Washington and Adams, and it seems like presidents were really on the honor system. And so now we're starting to see some holes, right?
Mm.
But there were two observations I had that I found really interesting about Trump. And number one is a lot of people would argue that he's doing what FDR did in reverse.
Mm.
So he's dismantling the federal government via executive order, whereas FDR built it up. But there's a slight difference here, because where FDR was accused of expanding the government's power, Trump isn't decreasing it.
Mm-hmm.
He's just collecting more of it under the office of the presidency, right? So
Right.
I think that should concern us. I think number two, interestingly enough, is we're kind of right back to where we were during the Articles of Confederation, where a weak Congress is leading to the demand for a strong executive. And to use Elon Musk's phrase, we are at a fork in the road.
Mm.
Where do we want to go?
Yeah, the founders had created 3 co-equal branches of government for a specific reason, right? You had the legislative branch to create laws, the executive branch to enforce them, and the judicial branch to interpret the law and when certain overreach by either the legislative or the executive branch might happen. When one of those branches completely fails, that causes a lot of problems. And right now we're seeing that with Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the listeners should know that it's not going to end with Trump. Any president that follows, as long as there's this do nothing Congress, it's perpetual gridlock of nothing getting done. The majority party not wanting to, do anything that might anger their leader, and the minority party not having any power at all to do anything about it, right? If we continue to see this, we're going to see perpetual rule by executive order.
And so let's land where we always land, Shawn. What do we need to do to get a more effective Congress? I mean, I'll answer the question, right? I'm going to apologize because if this isn't your first time listening, you've heard this a million times before. Trump's control over Congress is due to a primary system where the most partisan, polarized voters control who ultimately makes it into office. And where 80% of seats in Congress are safe seats, the partisan base has control over 80% of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Trump has control over the Republican half of that 80%. And so there is no way you are going to get an independent Congress that defies the executive unless you remove the lever that is our primary system. And as we've noted before, Shawn, and as some of you may have heard before, states with open, nonpartisan primary systems have the most independent legislators out there. So all of the Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump and survived were from open primary states.
Right. In a state like Alaska, you have U.S. senators like Lisa Murkowski, who remain one of the few who are willing to stand up to Trump, including voting against some of his most insane choices for cabinet. But also, when you talk to the legislative leaders in that state, they say that under the nonpartisan top 4 primary system that they have been able to establish bipartisan coalitions like they never have before, because the incentive structure under that system is for them to have a broader appeal among voters rather than a partisan minority.
And so if we don't want an imperial president, then we need a strong Congress to serve as a check on that imperial president. And we can't have a strong Congress when we have weak elections. So we're going to leave it there, Shawn. I feel like that. What do you think?
A great place to leave it.
All right. Thank you very much for listening. If you liked what you heard today, please write a review, rate this episode, and most importantly, share this with somebody you feel needs to hear it. A lot of us are feeling hopeless about what's going on right now, and the reforms we talk about can be put into place at the state level, where people like you, me, And Shawn, you too, Shawn, have real power. Music, courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you once again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.